Sure. Okay. So, so we'll get started and hope that people will come trickling in. I know this is a busy hour, the lunch hour. My name is Mayanna Molman. I'm Director of Programs here at the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our small conference room. We are going to be filming this event, and so we may use pieces of the videotape part of this event online. If you do not want to appear online, please let my colleague Suzanne know after the event, and we'll make sure that whatever portion you're in will not be used. Obviously, we won't put your name, etc. in any case, so it would just be a likeness. We're merely filming Dorothy and Chester, but just we want to make sure that you're not appearing somewhere you don't want to appear. Also, because of the filming, if you could be so good as to silence or turn off better your cell phones, that would be best.
I think it's now so that I don't film anyone.
Right. Yeah, this is true. If you don't want to be filmed and you feel comfortable raising your hand saying, I really don't want to be filmed, please do so now so our camera person knows this up front. Well, you're sitting in a good spot if you want to be filmed. So we're here today mainly to listen to Dorothy A'ken'ova and Chesterfield Samba, our colleagues from Nigeria and Zimbabwe. Dorothy and Chester have been here for a couple of days now with us doing advocacy at the UN General Assembly Third Committee to try to make sure that a resolution that's currently being negotiated says that nobody can be killed because of their real or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. And we thought that it would make sense today to talk a little bit about both the work that Dorothy and Chester are doing in their countries, but also the linkages to the advocacy that we do in the North. And that might be sort of the interest that you all could have also in how to be better how do we be better at being in solidarity with each other, and how to share both ways as we do advocacy. So I think it would make sense to just go around the table so we all know who's here, and then I will give the floor to Dorothy and Chester. So just briefly, your name and your affiliation, if you have one, so that our guests know who you are.
I'm Shep Wannen. No specific affiliation, although I'm affiliated with many different gay groups.
Okay.
I'm Mark Black. I'm a neighborhood supporter, and I've been involved with Queer Nation.
Yeah, me too, Queer Nation.
One liner, neighborhood supporter.
I'm YG. I'm a student at the Columbia School of Social Work.
Hi, I'm Lucas. I'm a student at Columbia Law School.
I'm Devin from Telnet, the Global Network for Publications Law.
Adam Frankel. I work in the LGBT program at Human Rights Law.
Alan Silverman. I'm a former UN staff member working for UN AIDS and before that for UNICEF. Now working as an independent consultant for the UN, and a lot of the work is on LGBT issues.
Thank you. We're just going around saying our name and our affiliation, so welcome to the newcomers. If you want to, Taylor, you want to start in that end?
I'm Taylor Luchowski, and I'm a program intern here at Eaglehurst.
Hi, I'm Saida Ali. I'm a program officer with the International Men's Health Foundation. I'm Frederica Steins, also program officer at IWAC.
I'm part of NER.
I'm Hugo Fernandez, and I work as a photographer and deal with a lot of gay issues in my life.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Lubna. I'm a Middle Eastern and North Africa program intern.
Rios. I'm a grant proposal writer here at Eaglehurst.
My name is Sarah, and I'm the executive assistant here at
And Suzanne Tribble, I'm the communications director here also at the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission.
So welcome everyone. We also have a number of people who are listening in on a Google Hangout. This is the microphone. When we come to a question and answer sort of dialogue session, I may repeat your question to make sure that our friends on the line can also hear us. So without further ado, I want to give over the floor to Chesterfield Samba from GALZ in Zimbabwe first.
Thank you very much, Marianne. My name is Chesterfield Samba. I'm the director for the Gays and Lesbians of Zimbabwe. Basically, it's an organization that seeks to promote and protect the rights and interests of LGBTI people in Zimbabwe. It has been in existence since 1990, and we provide direct services to the community in the form of legal support, peer support, counseling, HIV and AIDS information dissemination. We do also work around documentation of human rights violations. And on another angle, we also lobby influential, could be government policy advisors on issues that impact on the lives and interests of LGBTI people in Zimbabwe. I've been involved in the organization for a number of years now, since probably 1992 when I came out. And I think for me, this is a really passionate issue for me, because when I came out, I thought about me being the only one in the situation that I was in, where at that point I thought it was rather odd that I can be the only gay person in Zimbabwe. So in my quest, I thought about discovering others, and I thought about also there were also a number of individuals that were probably in the situation that I was in. So it really is a matter that is close to my heart, and I still want to continue to see the realization of rights and dignity for LGBTI people in Zimbabwe. I'd like to thank Eagle Hug for offering us this opportunity, and also thank you to all of you that are here today to listen to us. Thanks.
Okay. Dorothy A'ken'ova. I'm a feminist and a sexual rights activist. I believe that the ICPD program of action is a very good starting point for people who want to work on sexual rights issues, and so I use that always as my Bible. From that, I understand the intersectionalities of rights, and also appreciate the broad way that sexual rights could be interpreted, understood, and even operationalized in the lives of individuals at the community level, and how that can be linked with advocacy, not only at the national level, but also at such a high level as the UN. And as a result of my affiliation with the global women's rights movement, especially working closely with IWHC during the processes of appraisal for the ICPD and Beijing after 5 years of implementation, we decided to start INCRESE, sexual rights organization based in the north of Nigeria, that would facilitate access to information and services on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And after a few years of working within the Sharia north of Nigeria, we realized that there were lots of intersections between women's human rights and LGBT rights and rights of persons with disabilities and sex workers, and that influenced the target beneficiaries of the work that we do. Recently, we have strengthened our work in the area of the girl child, focusing on reducing or preventing child marriages within the north of Nigeria. This need, of course, has been rubbed hard into our eyes by the Boko Haram abductions and forceful marriage between the girls and the insurgents. But also very close to the heart of INCRESE is the work we've done with LGBTI organizations in Nigeria, starting from working with social networks that operated largely within the closet, and in 2000 coming out as organization to engage in body politics and fighting for dignity for sexual minorities. And in this quest, we have fought several times the introduction of the bill prohibiting same-sex marriages. we know that that title is misleading because it does worse things than that. And sadly, in January this year, that was signed into law. And so we do presently have a law prohibiting same-sex marriages and other, civil liberties that people would enjoy, not only to LGBTI people, but also generality of the population, as the law is very bogus and does not define anything specifically. Yeah, right now we have filed a suit against the federal government and the House of Assembly that passed that law, and that is where we are at now. So it's a pleasure to share with you all the experience that we have working at the community level.
As a first follow-up, I had this question of what effective or what healthy international collaboration looks like. We have had some conversations over these past couple of days of some of the influences that can be good and some of the influences that can be bad coming from the outside. So if you could speak to what are elements of healthy, useful international collaboration?
It's a very interesting question. I think when we look at the Zimbabwean context and how the politicization of the gay issues have played out, it's important to have these collaborations, and I think it's important in a way to try and create a cohesive response to the challenges that LGBTI people are facing in most of our different countries, especially in Africa. I think for now we look at Africa as the dark continent in terms of LGBTI issues and a whole lot of other issues. But that is not to say that the attitudes of people on the ground are very negative towards LGBTI people. And that is not to say there is no community or society of LGBTI people that are increasingly living positive lives or are able to get to access the services that they require. But there remains a certain section of our community that is still finding it very hard to come out, to live openly, to be able just to declare that their sexual orientation. So it's an issue of also we cannot apply just a straitjacket approach to interventions in Africa. That is why it is important for me to continue to have these dialogues with different partners, different countries, and different strategies that have been used over the years, and try and see how we can contextualize those approaches in a manner in which we can begin to see effective responses that can lead to a betterment of the lives of LGBTI people on our continent. When we look at how our governments are responding to what I would want to say the emergence of LGBTI activism or organizing, it's mainly around certain topical issues in the country. In Zimbabwe, I wouldn't want to say we're a very powerful organization that really is giving our government nightmares. But our government, I think, has seen that the issue itself is very effective in distracting people's attention from the real issues affecting our countries. And once you start talking about gay marriage, for instance, you are likely to draw on people's emotions, so much so that they forget about the poverty that they're facing, the bad governance that's happening in the country, and all the other issues that are impacting on the country as a whole, the economy itself. So it seems to be a major draw card. Like in Zimbabwe, we know that when it's election time, it's problem time for LGBTI people. We know definitely our president, as soon as he gets the podium, he's going to say something around the issue. I can give you an example. When we were going through the constitutional process of amending our constitution, we put in a submission as the Gay and Lesbian Organization in Zimbabwe, and we were focusing on 3 principles that we wanted to see at least included in the Bill of Rights, which would be the right to privacy, right to equality, and non-discrimination, as we thought that those 3 elements somehow, somewhere, impact on the work that we do and impact on the lives that LGBTI people face. Immediately when they received our submission, the president had an opportunity to say, our opposition party is working with gay and lesbian groups to try and snuggle in issues around gay marriage. So it became an agenda that was given to us that we didn't put on the table. Unfortunately, we were caught napping on that, and we had to respond to gay marriage as an issue that had been dumped on us. And immediately when they put gay marriage on the table, obviously people do get worried, and people would want to react to different issues that emerge from the prospect of having two men marrying in Zimbabwe. I think we are all at different levels on how we deal with issues of sexuality in Zimbabwe, and also at a situation where it's very difficult to talk openly about issues of sexuality and gender identity. So I think it's important that we continue to have these conversations and continue to try and come up with strategies that we think can ultimately provide progression or progressive realization of rights for LGBTI people in Zimbabwe. We cannot say that there's a framework that's tried and tested that can be used, but it's always situational. We, for instance, went for a number of months just being raided as an organization, which is one contradiction, where you find on the one hand the president is being very vocal, but on the other hand he's allowing us to operate and nobody is attacking us, but we continue to have this state-instigated harassment and violence, which is orchestrated at a state level. But then it doesn't speak to the attitudes that we see on the ground. For instance, we continue to see engagement with traditional leaders on the issue, people wanting to engage on the issue, wanting to understand what the issues are. And because our president has done this consistently over the years, I think it has also provided capacity for us as people that are organizing on the issue to see how we can effectively respond to that backlash that's coming from the president. And also, to some extent, he's providing free publicity, which is allowing us to get over the censorship laws that impact on us being able to advertise in the local press. We, for instance, wanted to place just a small counseling advert in our public newspaper, and they denied it on the basis that it's a family newspaper and cannot run such an advert. But when we wanted to go into the book fair, which one of our colleagues was talking about, immediately they put the full details on the front page, obviously trying to incite people into reacting into the organization. But what that did for us as an organization, it marked the turning point at which many people started making contact with the organization. So in the end, we got what we were trying to get from placing the advert, and we always continue to get free publicity from the attacks that our president has. We cannot continue to celebrate those. Obviously, we need to find ways of how our president needs to realize and start dealing with the real issues that are affecting the country. But we also have to give credit to him. In fact, to make him an honorary patron for our organization, because we continue to get this publicity and traction that we're gaining, which I think, in all fairness, if we were to be having given that platform to organize, we might not have been at the stage at which we are now in our organizing. So I think that's how we need to look at it.
I'm sure President Mugabe will be very happy to know he has been named an honorary patron of your organization. So Dorothy, you want to speak to this effective
partnerships? I think the starting point is to understand the linkages that exist in a globalized community. More and more things that happen out, in the north of the globe have direct influence on things that are happening in the global south. An example is just the manner in which we organize. The first time I came out here to work within the corridors of the UN, I experienced a level of organizing that I hadn't seen back home before. But at the same time, there were people from the right wing that the pro-lifers had brought also, who also experienced this method of organizing. And then we got back to Nigeria and were holding a national consultative forum on sexual reproductive rights. And there they were, these right-wingers doing the things that we do at the UN, you know. And so these linkages are very strong and they are very real. The same with the gains. The much we have seen in terms of gains, recognizing rights, we know how far we've gone in Geneva, starting from 2002, when the Brazilian resolution hit the UN Human Rights Council. At that time, there was lots of argument and postponement and so on and so forth. But more recently, we're seeing UN that is accommodating and adopting language on sexual orientation and gender identity and expressions at that level. Those are formidable gains, you know. The backlash is immense. And so we experience those gains. We use them to do advocacy at country level. We open new spaces for engagement with governments at local level. And this has been most manifest in the intervention on HIV, especially engaging men who have sex with men and sex workers and injectable drug users. But the backlash, just as it is at the global level, is the same that we're experiencing at the local level. And that is why we've repeatedly had this bill surfacing until it has now become law. The interesting thing here is the fact that we have worked hand in hand with the allies that we have in the global north to resist the pressure that we have in the global south and to try to change things, doing advocacy, you know, both ways. I recall that there was a time that we had public hearing and we went allowed into the National House of Assembly. We had to call the EU members in Italy through a colleague that we had who spoke with their mission in Nigeria, who called a senator, who instructed them at the gate to allow us in. You know, so these kind of partnerships, they are so real and so powerful and should be nurtured, you know, but in the right way, because we've also had experiences where people in the global north are not as sensitive as they should be to the issues, you know, back home. The fact that things have worked out here. For instance, I was having a conversation with an activist who said, you know, there are young people who have come from Nigeria to say we should out members of the House of Assembly who were part of passing that law. And the person said, you know, we did that in my country and it worked. But in Nigeria, that won't work because it's a lawless country. People are going to pick up people and make them disappear, and we are not going to have a clue what has happened. We don't have any data for fingerprints or eye photographs or DNA, so that is just going to be a mayhem. So the partnerships are very beneficial. They work very well in times of need, potentially risky where the allies at the global north do not pay attention to the very delicate situation that we have on ground. But generally speaking, it's been a very good relationship. We've had capacity building as a result of our engagement with allies in the global north. We've had input, for instance, recently on the litigation process as we prepared our summons. Out here were groups, you know, who have experience in strategic litigation who worked with us very closely. We've been able to pressure our governments, both in a diplomatic way and quiet way, you know, behind closed door kind of diplomacy, but also outwardly through collection of signatures and all the rallies in Washington, in New York. Those things have impact back home. and they make a difference. They make the government understand that someone is watching. If that was not the case, I think they would have caught all of us, imprisoned us, just locked us away somewhere. But the fact that they know that people are looking globally makes it impossible for them, especially in Nigeria, to come after those of us who are on the front lines. So it's a very cherished partnership.
On that note, and sort of a little bit the contextualizing that you both are talking about, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the effectiveness or not of aid conditionalities. A number of northern governments have started saying, well, there has to be respect for LGBTI persons, or else we will not provide certain amounts of aid. There was a whole review of the U.S. engagement with Uganda after the passage of the Anti-Homosexuality Act there. Obviously, no such thing happened with Nigeria, but President Mugabe has been very vocal about the UK, for example, intending to condition some aid based on respect for LGBTI communities. So if you could speak a little bit to how does this play from where you're sitting? Do aid conditionalities work? Is it helpful? Is that part of the somebody's watching, or is it just generating backlash?
Generating backlash. I've always thought about the way we handle our fear for backlash. Like, we do not want backlash, but we cannot have gains and not have backlash. The thing is to put in place mechanisms to cushion the impact on the populations that are directly affected by the backlash. So from where I stand, no fear for backlash. I have campaigned all along, especially for the Nigerian situation, for reviewing the manner aid is channeled to the country. We are not saying cut it off. We are only saying rechannel it. It doesn't make sense to give us funding to sensitize population and advocate for LGBT rights, and then channel resources to organizations that are going to erode those rights. It's like giving with right and taking with the left hand. And so we are saying rechannel the aid. Give it to those who are consistent with the principles of human rights, people who understand the value of personal dignity and who are prepared to work to respect that. I think for me, that is the way to go. People have argued that it was effective on Uganda to talk about, cutting off or rechanneling aid because they are not as big an economy as Nigeria because of the crude oil that we have and so on. And so people have dragged their feet in reviewing, relationships with the country. But I do not agree with that. I believe that whatever is done with aid, rechanneling it, will have just as much impact on the Nigerian government as it did on Uganda. And this is my reason for saying so. Over 90% of our HIV programming funds come from the international community. Nigeria contributes about 3%, and all of that is only through infrastructure. So if we were to rechannel that and take it out of the hands of the government, that would make a huge impact, especially knowing how they like to portray themselves in the Committee of Nations, as giant of Africa. They're not likely to find this funny at all. So I believe that it will have impact. The reproductive health programs that we have for women, for young people, all those fundings come from outside of the country. And if for any reason those resources get rechanneled, the government would feel a huge impact, because what is Federal Ministry of Health going to run on other than, the aid that is coming in? And it is very contradictory for us to continue to nurture these monsters and speak to protection of LGBT rights. The National Action Committee on AIDS in Nigeria, for instance, after this law was passed, came out in public to say the law has no impact, adverse impact on programming on HIV/AIDS. But that is a lie, because I sit in my house and I have phone calls all through the night from men who have sex with men who are in panic, not knowing whether when next they go to show up for their ARV, they're going to be arrested. There are lots of men who have STIs, genital warts, and they are afraid to present themselves at hospitals because they are afraid of getting arrested. And all of this fear has increased greatly with the passing of the law. So if the NACA is making that kind of statement and we are not doing anything to point out to them that they are wrong, then we are living in contradiction. And so we really need to revisit the issue of how we continue to relate with governments that single out groups of people and make them targets of violence.
I would want to echo the same, and also probably look at how, as nations, like for Zimbabwe, for example, our president has been on the issue of sovereignty. That's his most favorite word, sovereignty, for sovereignty. And for him, then, the whole notion around human rights for all, before we even get to issues of rights pertaining to LGBTI people, he doesn't believe in that. And how does he resist that? By saying, well, when the West talks about human rights, what they actually mean is same-sex marriage. So it's a convenient agenda that he's using to resist accountability, to resist his issues around how he needs to uphold the human rights of each and every individual in Zimbabwe. So he has championed this whole notion around, oh, we need to be a sovereign nation, we can do what we want, as a way of him avoiding the issues that he needs to be accountable to. And hence it brings out the issue of the cost of exclusion, or the impact of excluding certain individuals of society. This issue applies to, like in our context, gays and lesbians, the white community, other tribal issues come into play, and how certain sections of Zimbabwean society have been marginalized in terms of development, in terms of education, and all those other issues. Hence, you find that this whole issue around aid conditionality then plays into and fits in well with his agenda of pushing for sovereignty. And hence it then becomes so confused and diluted in the whole notion that, well, when the West talks of human rights, they actually mean gay rights, and who would want to uphold such rights? We need to resist this. Hence, our issue then becomes a convenient issue that he can use to, like I said earlier, to divert people from the real issues. So we need really to be focused on how we need to separate these issues and look at them. I think it's dangerous for us to continue to look at or talk about LGBTI rights. What we need to address are issues around human rights. And when we look at it from the notion that human rights apply to all, we also need to start looking at how do we then apply human rights to people that have been marginalized, historically marginalized people, or people of a different sexual orientation and gender identity that people haven't really thought about or continue to keep on the margins. So it's quite an interesting issue to explore, and how we need to look at its effectiveness in terms of how it has worked. I think we cannot just say let's apply aid conditionality across nations. But when you look at the Uganda example, would we be then talking about where we are now, that the bill has been stalled, if the West hadn't intervened in the way it has? It has its upside, but it also has its downside. And I think we need to, I think, honestly interrogate those two sides and look at what's the best way in terms of advancing issues shouldn't be people speaking out on issues that affect human rights for everybody. And I think when you look at that cost of exclusion, it's also having an impact on the West. We're having our African activists running to the West. Now people are beginning to talk about how we need to revisit migration laws. And that's the cost of exclusion that we're talking about. And it's starting from our countries who are beginning to really look at LGBTI issues as the issue that needs to be sorted out, as the monster and whatever. So I think we need to continue to have dialogue around that issue. I don't have a position to say bad or it's good, but we need to interrogate both sides of the story and look at the impact that it's making. We need to look at our struggle in exactly the same way we looked at when our countries were fighting for independence, for example, when people were fighting for the removal of apartheid in South Africa. Those are issues and strategies that people used, and we need to look at what's effective in that instance.
The answer is, as usual, it depends.
What the weather is like out there.
Yeah.
Sure.
I have one last question, and then we'll open the floor, and it's about the impact of these largely anti-homosexuality moves on the trans community. So often there's this conflation of, we talk about sexual orientation, gender identity as the same, we talk about the LGBTI community, but when we look at the laws, it really is about consensual adult same-sex relationships, and really not about gender identity. Or is it, is the question. What's the impact of all of these political movements on the trans community?
Well, when I look at our movement as a whole, I think the trans community is the face of the movement. When you talk about gay issues, I think, and to any ordinary man on the street, the description that they give you is about a trans person. The perception that they have about gay people is that of a trans person. So I think when you look at then the backlash or the harassment, the violence, the arrests that take place, mainly it's the trans community that remains on the front line and that bears the brunt of everybody else. And so there is need for us to look at how we are continuing to provide support to the trans community, and we also need to acknowledge that in whatever we do, the backlash first is received by the trans community. Hence, there's need for us to come up with ways of which we provide support for the trans community. The other challenge that we have as an organization or as a community is that we don't understand ourselves or each other. So we also need to get to a point where LGBTI people themselves are also empowered to understand what it means for a trans person, what it means to be a trans person, what are the issues, what is the politics, and then we also begin to see how we can support each other across the identities. And I think for me that's the starting point. We need to be able to understand issues as they apply to each and every identity in our community.
Yeah, I agree with you totally that the trans people are always at the receiving end, or they start to get, because the Nigerian context, for example, if you went out on the street and asked people, like, can you recognize who is gay by looking at them? They'll tell you yes, they can. And if you ask them further, which we have, like, what would you see in a man that is homosexual? Then they'll tell you, okay, he will make hands like a woman and blink eyes like a woman and walk like a woman and talk like a woman, you know. So all of those like a woman things, yeah, are the things that are going to keep coming up. It's the same thing when you ask them questions about where are homosexuals found in Nigeria. The answer you will get automatically is north of Nigeria. And why north? Because the Hausa tradition had a place for the transvestites. And they were a recognized part of our population. I grew up with endowdos within the community, and we were neighbors. So people these days conclude that Ndaudu is a homosexual. That was not so when we were growing up. We knew them as Ndaudu, and that was it. You know, they were effeminate men, you know, who did those chores that women do. Some of them worked at brothels and pimps, and they were comedians. They dressed brides. They participated in social events as caterers. You know, those were the Ndaudu. And what happened is that that space began to accommodate other identities. It was easier for a gay man to go within the trans community to ask someone out than ask someone out in their office or working place, you know. And so that space provided accommodation for several other identities. Unfortunately, even pedophiles took over that space. In 1999, when I did a preliminary survey on the way the Andaudism has evolved over the years, I discovered that, you know, this space has been taken over by just everyone and everybody. And that is what creates the problem now, that makes people think that Ndaudu is a homosexual. You know, and that's the kind of interpretation that we have. So when Nigeria went fully Sharia in 2000, the Sharia clerics decided that they were going to rid the north of the homosexual community. What they actually did was to go into those settlements where the trans people were, arrest them, beat them up, lock them up, you know, and so everybody fled or went underground. And so the question of identities, you know, is one that requires lots of education back home where we are, so that people understand, you know, what being a trans means, what being a homosexual means, what being a pedophile means, because oftentimes, you know, they mix all of this up, and in the end, the picture we get is that the pedophile is the homosexual. And of course, around the table, we know that's not so. So those are the kind of things that we need to do, and do on a large scale. Educate people, not only our communities, but generality of the population, to understand the different identities that there are as essential components of comprehensive sexuality education. Because sometimes we don't make an issue of it, but it's very, very important that people have access to sexuality education, and a comprehensive one.
Thank you. So I would now like to open the floor for question or comments for our guests. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you for very, very interesting perspectives from both of your countries. The first question I have goes back to the question that you mentioned around whether cutting off AIDS or having conditionality on aid is effective or not. And I know that you said, Chesterfield, that it depends. There's pluses and minuses. And one of the things that you mentioned, Dorothy, was that rechanneling is probably the most effective means. So my question is actually around the rechanneling. And the rechanneling question is the following, and that is that, you know, there's literally, on the global level, billions of dollars at stake here. Billions of dollars. And number one, is there capacity for rechanneling of all those billions of dollars? I would like your point of view. I don't think so. I don't think that all of that money can be rechanneled. And you know, and part of that is that, for example, even with the with NACA in Nigeria denying that there's an impact on men who have sex with men, for example, if all of the money that's now going to NACA were to be cut off and rechanneled, would people who are affected by HIV be getting the services they need? You know, I'm not sure how to approach it. I don't have the answer to how to approach it. But certainly in cutting off all the money that's going to HIV programs in Nigeria from those actors who are making LGBT statements would do an amazing disservice to the country as a whole, and perhaps create even greater backlash from the government and from people in general. So I'm wondering, how is all that money going to be rechanneled? That's my first question. I have others, but start with that one.
Yeah, this capacity question, I always find it, okay, I get concerned about questions around capacity. What is the capacity of the Nigerian government in handling this fund? When they can buy 2 bulletproof vans for a minister of aviation with money enough to buy up to 50. What is the capacity of the Nigerian government or NACA to handle those funds, given the measure of corruption that we have in the country? I think that we need to start speaking up and telling the truth, that the paperwork that comes out painting results of HIV interventions may not be very factual if they are properly investigated. The government would hold this HIV/AIDS money. Recently, we were working on preparing concept note for Global Fund. And of all the millions that were going to come in, how much were they giving the key affected population? $1 million. We had to walk out of the meeting, put pressure on the Global Fund in Geneva, to put pressure on the country coordinating mechanism to raise it to 5 million for all the key affected population in the country. That questions the capacity, as far as I'm concerned, of the government to manage the resources that are there. Now, there are alternatives that we can explore. The alternatives include channeling them through networks. Because if you went to a little organization that may not have the ability to absorb the huge amounts of money that, by the way, who is doing the work? It's us, the little organizations at the community level. And we do it for nothing, really. This year, my organization was approached by an international partner to do HIV intervention. And there are no office rent monies in there. There is no salaries for staff in there. And then they say, you are going to be putting like 25% of your work time, and that is just how much they are giving. But the truth is that we are putting 100% of our time. I had to put my foot down and say, no, let's return this project. It's going to kill the other projects that have sustained us all along the years. So we have a situation where people who are trusted to be able to manage these resources are given the resources. But we at the community level that are not trusted to be able to absorb these fundings are the ones doing the work on the ground. There will have to be need for capacity building for community level organizations and networks to be able to manage the resources, put accounting procedures in place. That's what it takes, because right now what we are seeing is we are being driven by numbers, and it just gives me nausea when people come and they tell me, if in this month you do not meet your target, we are not giving you money for next month, even if it's one person that is missing. For me, that does not account or just, speak to the capacity to handle the kind of resources that are going in there to start with. If those fundings are channeled through international organizations like we've seen, Heartland Alliance, IWSC, Population Council, those international partners, we've worked with them. We know how they have developed us to be accountable, and to really do our work. That would be fine, rather than giving to government that is, they are actually just exploiting the situation to be comfortable, because the NACA chairperson has a good salary, he lives in a good house, he drives very good cars, and it is thanks to the money that should be used for MSM work. that he's doing that.
Maybe for me, the way I look at it is how are we then looking at same-sex communities in the countries that we're coming from? Are we creating a certain sect of individuals that are superior to the general population in the country? When I look at AIDS, when it lands in the country, ideally, yes, it should go out to everyone, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Is this happening? No. Is it going to the general population also? No. So how do we then try and really pull out the LGBTI community and say, you are deserving of this aid? I think to a certain extent, it then creates that issue of backlash, and very strongly, I think we would be against such an idea. But when we look at channeling what that we're talking about, there is a very strong sense of civil society in our countries. Are they ready to embrace the language of equality? Are they there yet? We need to interrogate that. I would think they're not, because of how they have struggled with the issues around human rights and embracing diversities and embracing other marginalized communities. Should we be having conversations that, well, your issue is a difficult issue, or should we be saying everybody is equal and we need to have equal access to whatever is available in the country? I think that's where the conversation should be going, than to create a subsect of community to say, well, the laws don't allow us to engage with you. We need to look at how, well, my registration will be affected. You know, those are the issues that we're finding in civil society that has had access to these resources that ideally should be applied to everybody. So again, it's a bit of a catch-22 for me to say, okay, so what is the best strategy around aid? Should it go directly to government, or should we be looking at directing our energies to ensure that our governments are more accountable to the people? Should we be holding them more accountable? And if so, how should we be doing that as people on the ground? And regardless of whether you're coming from a gay community, or you are a woman, or you're affected by HIV and AIDS, I think we all are affected by those issues: access to health, unemployment, bad governance, bad politics. That's how
and
I
then
look
you
at
still want to put yourself in a
Money,
condition where you have to hold that same government accountable. I mean, how well have you done that? And for all I know,
it's a rock and a hard place for
you know,
me.
yeah, it's a very difficult question that you put
and
forward,
I think
but
it's
you know,
important that we continue to try and look at effective ways of engaging on that issue.
but I'm tired of all the looking. You know, it's true. All the
You
time
need
we are saying,
action.
let's have dialogue, let's
Yeah.
discuss, let's this. Now it's time to act. You know, let us really like translate everything that we've been saying into action. We can't continue to dialogue till kingdom come. You know, let us do something and let us do it now.
Yeah.
The communities are there now. You know, they have needs that are real for this time now. And so the solutions should be applied now. And let us start to try out these things and see how they work. You know, the governments are corrupt, we are saying it. So why do I want to put my money in the hands of a government that is corrupt? You know.
Interesting.
I saw another question here. Yeah.
How do you feel about American or maybe even European businesses putting pressures on your government? Because some of us here that have been involved with Free Nation, in addition to Israel, have managed to meet with the controllers of New York State and New York City. We weren't asking for divestment, but just for the companies that our pensions are invested in, in other words, for those companies now to put pressure on the governments in Africa as well as in Russia to at least enforce their own policies about non-discrimination, and maybe that would then trickle down to just the people themselves and attitude.
Yeah, we've had those conversations, and my opinion was that right now what we can do as companies is to make those policies clear. I sat in a vehicle with someone who worked in the US embassy, and we got talking, and he asked me, what I did for a living, and I told him everything, including the LGBT rights activism, that I do. And I could feel like he was not so 100% comfortable with it, but he dared not say anything wrong, and that is as a result of the policy in place in his place of work. So if we have all these private organizations and companies have policies that are clear, but not only policies, but have also a way of reinforcing and have a way of dealing with people who breach, then that would go a long way to change the mindset of Nigerians who work within those companies. And that will now seep through gradually to the general population. And I was also asked, like, what do I think the private sector in Nigeria can do? I think that they can pull resources together and start to provide scholarships for LGBTI persons within the country who are forced out of school as a result of bullying, or because they are expelled from homes by families, and all the support is withdrawn from them. And this puts them in a very precarious position. I'm Dorothy, I'm here in New York. If I have a woman in my room, it's my business. And then I can go back home and, straighten my collar and, continue my heterosexuality. But what happens to the person at the grassroots level who has no income, or who has little income and has to live in an accommodation where everybody sees what happens in the other person's bedroom or hears what happens in the other person's bedroom? So they are not able to even keep a closet in their lives, because the closet is just as open as the entire world. So if we begin to provide scholarships, then we will have people who have better income and who can live their sexualities and not be as endangered as they are right now. It will also provide us professionals. We want doctors who are LGBT. We want lawyers, because the other ones will not do the work, but we can't get them. The best thing is to begin also for the private sector to have, scholarship schemes for LGBTI people. And of course, supporting us, to put pressure on our government by making resources available for us to be at the right places at the right time, to speak with who counts. And they have these golf games during the weekend, and they laugh loud and drink coffee together. Those are spaces that they can bring us in, so that as we drink the coffee and laugh together, we can tell each other a few truths. All those opportunities the private sector can help out.
I think for for you here, that's where the issue around leverage comes in. If for instance IBM works in Zimbabwe, and here they have their values, their principles for which they embrace equality, diversity, I think it's also time to start putting pressure on them to say, shouldn't this apply to everyone and all the countries that you're working in? And surely as taxpayers here, you can also say, shouldn't my tax be used in this way, supporting human rights or upholding human rights, than creating situations where we're seeing activists fleeing, activists dying, and sustaining bad governance in our countries. So it's also an area where our collective activism can come into play, I think.
Any more questions? We'll do Adam here, and then Suzanne. Okay.
I'm wondering, Dorothy, if you could speak more about how your organization specifically, but other groups that you work with in Nigeria, have been able to resist and continue operating since the law was signed. I mean, it is so sweeping. And you mentioned a couple of examples of petitions and organizing abroad has helped somewhat, but what have you done in Nigeria to combat the forces of the law?
Okay. We have friends, but they are very, very few. And those friends have provided spaces for us to meet, if there was need to. So we've had meetings, we've had conferences, that have happened in Nigeria. Initially, we went out to have those meetings, like in Cotonou, in Ghana, Now we are saying, no, let's have those meetings back here in Nigeria, and we are doing that. And so far, we've not had, any mishaps since the law was passed. And I think what's happening is that it is the neighborhoods that run with the law much faster than government and law enforcement agents. It was the neighbor who thought that this guy must be gay, who did something to that guy, and it was not like a police person who came to arrest anybody, except of the Sharia context, where we have the Sharia police that go to bust, parties and so on. And I think last week there was a gay party that was barged into in Abuja by the Environmental Protection Agency. But I think because the party was in a neighborhood that is residential, and that was the second party in 3 or 4 days, and maybe the neighbors needed some sleep, and so they did that. I think it didn't have a sexual orientation note to it, eventually, because we followed it up immediately. Apart from those, it's been the neighbors that have been implementing the law. So what we've done is to pursue peace with our neighbors so that they don't tell on us. Yeah. Our office is still operating, is safe, but largely because within the neighborhood they know the integrity and the value of the work that we do and the difference that we bring in people's lives, and so it's been safe. What we have done with members of the community that are working at the grassroots level on HIV especially is to continue to give education on security, how they can keep safe, the tips, on how to keep safe. We also have provided capacity building in how to handle information, including rumors, like someone sends a message on their, or puts on their status, gay person, whatever, beaten up in Suleja. Now, what people will do is they won't ask questions. They'll just pass it on to someone else, who will pass it on to someone else, and then it will go viral. And then people will have anxiety and panic attacks, So what we've done for the community is to tell them, when you get a message like that, count 10 times. Call one of the leaders in the movement to confirm if this is indeed true and what can be done about it, rather than just in panic spread rumors, because sometimes they are not true. They are just put there to create panic in the community. And the other thing that we've done has been the psychosocial counseling, psychosocial support that we've been giving. We had to scale it up, after the law was passed. We did a lot of training for NGOs to be able to give this service to members of the communities where they are. So if someone came into their office, they had a standard needs, psychosocial needs assessment, form that they were going to use to track the life of the person and see what kind of support that person needs. And we have also more safe homes around the country. So if people are even unsure or feel in any way that they are under threat, either they are human rights defenders or they are community everyday person, they can, apply to come into the shelter for a while, and they can, with the service providers, investigate the setting where they are and see how the person can be reintegrated or relocated to mitigate the impact of the law. I think we have had issues within the movement that slowed down the filing of the case in the court, but we have finally done that. And that has been very helpful because a lot of committee members feel like, oh, okay, finally, someone is doing something about this. And we are seeking the court to make a pronouncement before we even proceed to say, hey, let's not implement this law. Let's take a good look at it first before we start to implement it. And those are some of the things that we've done in-house to ensure that work goes on. Yeah.
There's a question here.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing so much incredible information. Dorothy, you had mentioned something about the effectiveness of demonstrations and actions that took place in Washington and New York. For some of us who participated in those, we're always kind of concerned about imposing our views and how things are interpreted back home. Could you just comment on how, when we do actions and public demonstrations, and how we can be more effective with our messages?
Yeah, I think that to start with, those demonstrations happened with the knowledge of people on ground. People always asked us, like, when is it best for us to speak about this or to have public demonstration about that? And so we assessed the atmosphere, and we knew, like, okay, now it's time, you know, from the international community, make a noise, you know, and that came through. And that is how we can make it impactful, when we work in collaboration with people at the community level who are able to assess what is going on, to say this is the right time. For instance, we filed the suit, but we've not gone to do a press conference because we just don't want a press conference now. It's not harmful to tell the allies that we have filed the case, but we're not about to call New York Times to say, publish it, we filed the suit, and this is the content, and these are the plaintiffs. No, we don't want to do that right now. There may be time that may be right for us to do that. We've made provisions for that in our strategic litigation plan. And so at that time, we will call for that kind of publicity on the case. So I think that the way to make it most effective is to work hand in hand with people at the community level, so that they dictate the time that that can happen without making it feel like, you know, they are taking over the case, you know, from the community level. The other thing that you asked was, without feeling like imposing your views on, yeah, because many times they have said that homosexuality is imported, you know. I think that is blackmail, really, because they want to shut you up so you don't do your obligations. You have responsibility. You owe to us something, just like we owe to you as well. So when they shut you up by saying, yes, you're demonstrating that because homosexuality is Western, they just want you to freeze, you know, and we must not allow them to succeed. If we buy into that, then the tendency is for the northern, you know, hemisphere to keep quiet and then leave us to die and suffer in silence. It's blackmail. It's just like the government saying sovereignty, you know. What is sovereignty? You know, what is it? We must not allow them to make use of those arguments to make us unable to fulfill our obligations as people.
Do you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, and the next question I had is related to the role of religious organizations. It's been very well known that Christian churches, both with influence from the outside, especially evangelicals, as well as even local movements within Africa, Christian churches, but certainly you mentioned Sharia, the law of the Islamic community as well, has been very negative overall, with a few exceptions, but overall has been quite negative in terms of helping or fighting against LGBT people. And I'm wondering, you know, what your organizations are doing, if anything, to try to engage the religious communities, and is there something perhaps from the outside from the north that might be helpful in your view in terms of trying to change the religious environment there? Because I mean, as we know, I mean, certainly this is a global phenomenon, and Africa certainly is very much part of this, and that is Africans are overall a religious people, and very much influenced by what's being said in churches and in mosques, and a lot of that has been, most of that has been quite negative.
The rise in religious fundamentalism. It's a minefield for our organizing back in our countries. And for us, how we look at it is the rise in poverty, basically. What has that done to us? It has created a new wave of prosperity prophets that preach prosperity. I think the gospel which they used to preach, that God is coming now, is sort of, losing traction. And what they're then preaching is, let's talk about prosperity. Come to church, this will happen, you'll be rich, your lives will be improved. And what we also see is the relationship between the state and the church. It has become so much such that they seem to be one, and they seem to speak the same language. And why is that? The church is the perfect ground where the politicians get the numbers. And of course the prophets do get the monies from the people. So there's a need for them to continue to work in harmony with each other, because it's a perfect breeding ground where the politicians get the support, the numbers that they so desperately need, and in turn the prophets also do get the money. And what are the issues that they are bringing out? Obviously, yes, it's the resistance to the West. Issues around sin, and sin also obviously translates to rise in homosexuality and organizing around gay activism in both our countries. So what do we need to do? We need to collectively resist this notion, and I think it's working for our politicians, but sadly for our communities, I think it's creating a new wave of harassment and violence, particularly from the church. Most of our, what I would term the traditional churches, haven't really spoken out on the issues. The Catholics, the Anglicans, and the likes, the Methodists, they seem to have remained aloof on the issue, and I think that they've lost that struggle, and the wave continues to grow around religious fundamentalism and this rise in prophets. We continue to try and engage with them, but it's very difficult looking at how that relationship cannot be separated of the church and the state. And so they seem to also enjoy the protection of the state, and so much so that we find it then very difficult to go in and have conversations with them, because whatever we try and do, they enjoy the protection of the state, and whatever the state does, it also enjoys the support of these prophets. So it's a very difficult area for us. We nonetheless continue to try and sensitize religious leaders. There are some that are coming on board that are speaking out, which is the good thing about the work that we do. Not everybody hates you, not everybody will speak the same language, so you always identify those sane voices in whatever sectors that you're trying and engage with. There are also, yes, politicians that we seem to think are more modest, more, and are willing to engage on the issues. And the same way we've also identified religious leaders that are speaking out, the same way we've also identified traditional leaders that are speaking out. So the only thing that we're trying to do is to create that discourse around embracing diversity. Yeah, so I think it's important for us.
I had a question here first, and then you, and then you. Okay.
So I think we've talked about religion, the governments,
Private
business,
sector,
and the impact of all of those groups. I'm wondering about the extent to which public press in either country, whether you find, uniform hostility, whether there's, some solidarity there. I'm just curious, if you could talk a little bit about how the issue plays out in the public press.
Just like there is polarization in politics, there's also polarization in the media. Like in Zimbabwe, for instance, we have public media that enjoys unfettered access to everything, can say what they want, no censorship whatsoever, can even deal with very difficult issues. And what we also see is the private media, the enactment of media laws that impact on the operation of those private media houses, the arrest of journalists and things like that. So there seems to be that polarization, and what it does then for us, we've been able then to work with those that are in situations similar to us, that are also facing this harassment from the state. So private media houses have been more accepting of engagement with organizations, to the point of even writing or accommodating opinion pieces, adverts, and we've then embarked on training journalists in those settings that are starting to dilute that message of homophobia that's coming out in state media, and I think it has been very beneficial for us that increasingly now media doesn't need to rely on us paying for space in their newspapers or in any form of media that we're talking about, but would want to counter what's coming or oppose what's coming from state media. So this polarization then seems to be helping us, but I don't think it's a fertile or an ideal environment in which we need to be operating in. Ideally, we need to be making use of public media, which has a more wider reach, which is easily accessible. But because of this censorship and this control of the state in that, we seem to then be enjoying the use of private media. But
The situation in Zimbabwe is different from ours,
yeah,
because the state-owned media and the private media are together. They are working together. Yeah, if the private media does anything against the government will shut them down. So we've had times where we had money to pay for them to publish, like the analysis we made of the law, and first they took the money, you want to, okay, put this money in the account and send the document by DHL. And 2 days later, they've seen the document. They're like, sorry, give us your account number so we return your money because we can publish this. So it's not the same. Yeah, in Nigeria, it's different. The public-private is all on one side, and then the activism is on the other side.
Referring back to what I was talking about, you said that you appreciated the demonstrations that took place here in D.C. We were involved in the ones here in New York against Uganda and Nigeria. And you said it was something about the timing of them, when it was. Well, how do we know when it's a good time to do it? I mean, we did a lot of demonstrations against Russia and Nigeria and Uganda, not against Zimbabwe and many other countries, which one of our members compiled a list of 80 bad countries. I mean, I'm sure there's more than that. So I mean, we can't demonstrate every day, but like, when is a good time? What is there a direct way of connecting with the Nigerian and Zimbabwe gay communities to know when is it appropriate to do something?
Yeah,
they haven't done anything lately. I'd like to do something.
Wait. Okay, let's do something.
Maybe. But like, not lately. Things can't be done there. So I mean, when do we do it? How do we contact?
Oh, you really want to do it? Yeah, like today.
Well, you said about responsibility. I agree with that, and also, and not only as Americans, but more importantly as New Yorkers, there's more foreign missions in New York than any other city on earth. They are all here. The ones that aren't even in D.C. or in Geneva or anywhere are here. We have everybody: North Korea, Cuba, Iran. We got them all. So So we have an obligation, since we're the capital of the world, we can demonstrate against everybody. They're all there, so.
Yeah,
It's an opportunity, other countries, cities don't have this opportunity, but we do.
Yeah, what happened is we do have Nigerians, LGBT people in the diaspora who communicate with us, who have links with organizations here. Yeah, that's Michael and Oliver and lots of other people.
We're not communicating lately.
Oh.
Is everything okay?
Yeah, I think he got a job somewhere. So he's trying to settle into it. Yeah.
More like information from Zimbabwe and the others also.
What we are trying to do now in Nigeria is to have a mailing list of international partners, so that quarterly we are giving out updates on what is going on, so that everybody is informed. And then through that list, we can also make requests to say, if you give me your contact information, I'll pass it to the people who are coordinating it. Yeah.
I think that's where EagleHug comes in, our partner, because they then play that bridge between the North and us.
You do more like background stuff. You don't do that much street activism, right? I mean, Jessica spoke at one of the rallies, but we get the impression that
we do more the bridging.
Right.
So that's what Chester is saying.
The
bridging,
because they are more aware of the situation on the ground, and they're able to advise the international community on what actions to take, what sort of strategies they can employ. And I think that's where the issue around staying connected comes in, and continuing to have these conversations and open communication between us.
But Dorothy was saying for Nigeria that our public demonstrations were good.
Wait.
How do we know?
Well, the Nigerian people led that one, the big one. They were the core.
I mean, if it's good for bring back our girls, it's good for the LGBT. Yeah.
So it's important, because we also have projects or activities that we do together with EagleHug and other international partners, and those can also inform strategies around actions that can be done in the North to further that. So please continue supporting EagleHug so that we continue doing that, and in the end I'm sure we will all be in a position where we're saying we're doing work together.
Yeah. Sure.
There's a question in the back over here.
Yeah, Dorothy, I just want to first appreciate what you said about the transgender communities in Africa, and specifically the need to recognize, and I know there is research and maybe it's not enough or the way it's been disseminated, the need to recognize how such communities existed, were tolerated, for lack of a better word, but it's more the coexistence that was there, and the way in those communities there was a name for transgender. I mean, I come from Kenya, and my mother is from the Akamba community, and the Akamba community is one of the communities that had the transgender persons appreciated for who they were, until when things shifted much later, perhaps in the early 2000s and things like that, and had people start giving names. And so here comes the whole notion or the issue around the politics around language, and how that shifts just the experiences and the realities of such persons in those communities. So that now, because then it's a different word being used, using a different language, it becomes, this is not ours, So the need for research, or the need to perhaps go back to bringing that back up and saying, this is what used to happen. In Kenya, there are communities where even a woman was allowed to marry another woman, traditionally, for reasons that then the community is able to say, these are the reasons why a woman is allowed to marry another woman. It was allowed, or it was there, it existed traditionally. So what is it that changes it when it comes to how we interact in different spaces and bring in different language, or have people politicizing how it is tied to sexuality. So that's very important about Africa, and perhaps conversations that are still remaining to happen or need to still be unraveled through research and be disseminated widely. And I'm sure a lot of our government representatives, some of them do know that this were the realities back then. And it doesn't change the situation in terms of years. It doesn't matter that it's some years down the line. These communities are still in existence. And then my question, which Samba can also respond to in terms of the wider human rights movement, specifically for you, Dorothy. I know for the African women's movement, embracing issues around LGBT has been a struggle. And this is what you're also alluding to when you're talking about the CSOs. And I'm just wondering, in the case of both Zimbabwe and Nigeria, and for you, Dorothy, it's even just largely the African feminist movement, which are the ways, or what do you see are the best ways to engage within those spaces? Because the truth of the matter is, if we take an example of the African women's movement and what the different women's movements do in the different countries, they carry the great bulk of doing work on gender, women's empowerment, gender rights, and women's rights and girls' rights. And it is within those spaces that we still have sisters that need to have recognition of their rights as part of the LGBT movement, and the same for the larger human rights movement for you, Samba, in Zimbabwe. Just how do we navigate these spaces? Because it's the examples you're giving, saying what has happened in Geneva, the resolutions, and what has happened at the global level, it helps. But it's helping in a space where we're having these battles around it's human rights for all. So how do we get the larger movement to embrace, these rights, and to see that you cannot say we're supporting women's rights back?
In Zimbabwe, I think we were so naive to think that we would enjoy the support of women naturally, or the women's movement. I think we were looking at how South Africa did it, and also in other sectors where it was the women's movement that basically provided the support that was needed to advance the issue. But what we see that happened in our country, I think I look at it from one aspect of fear and also prejudice. Why I say fear is because that our governments seem to be pushing that notion so much of instilling fear in anyone who wants to engage on this issue. What they've done successfully is to make sure that people become fearful of engaging on the issue, and they continue to sustain that so much such that the women's movement develops cold feet when they are presented with the issue. They're like, oh, our registrations. Because yes, it's a reality. People worry about their registrations, and once you lose your registration, you can't operate, and that's the end. Would you want to lose your registration simply because of speaking out for LGBTI issues? Sadly, we're not there yet. People are still worried about that. They would rather avoid the issue and continue to do the work that they're doing. But are there opportunities to work? Yes, there are, and I think we need to tap in to those safe zones that make individuals comfortable in engaging on topical issues such as this one. And how do we get there? I think we need to be able to create enabling spaces or platforms where we are all comfortable in speaking out. Should we then be advancing the notion of gay rights or LGBTI rights? I think there are also ways in which we can begin to include that language, but also continue to speak the language of equality and human rights in a way that everybody becomes comfortable in addressing the issues. That's how I would look at it for us. Yeah.
losing registration is a possibility. I was in a strategic meeting recently with people from Russia, and they were sharing how they were able to navigate this question. Was to develop a parallel profile and keep just in case, and then you go register. Like there was a lesbian organization that is registered as an economic something, network. So those are some of the things that we can tell our allies, so they know that it's not the end of the road for them. Losing registration for a good reason is worth it. I'd lose mine 10 times. It's been really a long road. You have walked all that path side as we have tried for the women's movement in Africa to embrace sexual diversity. I recall that in 2004 in Addis, when we were preparing for the 5 years review for Beijing, Fanian had just been murdered. And we had spent like 2 days before then, and each time this question of lesbian women or bisexual women came up, the whole amphitheater would break down. Like, we're talking here about forced child marriages, we're talking about maternal mortality, and you want to talk to us about sex? Who cares about sex? And that was the attitude that was there. 2 days later, Fanian gets killed. And that turned the conversation around. And we had Mutoni, Aisha, BC, all of those women, Ruth, they came out really strongly with the statement. We printed it out, announcing her death, and then asking the women whether it was worth it to just sit by and watch a woman like us get murdered simply because she's gay. And that caused a huge turnaround. And that was when the Feminist Forum was emboldened to come up with a charter that makes it mandatory. If you are in the Africa feminist movement, you must respect diversity. You must respect right to access to abortion. You must respect right to access to information and services to young people, regardless of whether they are married or not. And that was a huge gain that was made in that platform. And what has happened increasingly is for meetings to take place where we are inviting people, building capacities for people to understand what feminism is and invite them to join the movement. They have the charter right under their nose, so they know what they're signing out for if they are signing into the feminist movement. The women's movement is a lot more like fluid, so we can have all sorts of debates in there. There are pro-lifers that are in women's movement. There are people who don't support sex workers' rights that are in the women's movement, But what we'll continue to do is create spaces for education so that they understand the principles behind respect for rights, so that they understand the indivisibility of rights, so that a woman is a woman regardless of what her choices are, and that we must work to protect her rights fully and all around the life cycle. And having LGBT movement play a strong role in the feminist movement has also yielded a lot of results in how far we have been able to push the agenda for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expressions in the African continent. And we must continue to do this, where we have capacity building for LGBT groups, encouraging them to join the women's movement, to join the feminist movement, because it's only when they are in there that change is guaranteed. There were times that women's movement would meet and LGBT rights would not be mentioned. But as soon as, a few activists came on board and started, to play along, it wasn't at all the case that women would meet and way away and LGBT would not be mentioned. So we will continue to bring these emerging activists up and get them engaged with the movement, and hoping that someday we will strike a 50-50 in the policies and in the membership, that we have. And we must do the same for the mainstream human rights movement. In Nigeria, it is a shame. I tell you, when these bill struggles were on, we could count how many mainstream human rights NGOs would stand alongside with us for public hearing, trying to point out ordinary things that are in the bill that are harmful to everyone. The right to freedom of association is clear what that law would do to anybody in that regard. You cannot hug somebody in public or in private if that person is of the same sex as you are. In a society where we are so warm that we could walk, hand in hand for miles and nobody is thinking anything. And like Saida said, we have cultures in Africa, in Nigeria as well, where women marry women. The culture is on and it's recognized by the law. Recently, we were looking at the law and we saw that the law still recognizes women marrying women. But once this debate hit the world, even those from those communities are no longer proud of that tradition. They sit down and they are ashamed to, in fact, they will fight you if you mention it, that in their place, women marry women. They are, no, you can't leave that place, smiling anymore. That is how bad, these debates have made things go. But, we will just have to make sure that the LGBT community is mainstreamed with the women's movement and mainstream human rights movement, so that these segregations, can fade away with time.
This is an incredibly rich conversation. I wanted to pull out some of the points that I've heard both of you talk about and that also have come out in the different questions before we move to a close. We have set off time until 2, but I'm very conscious of the fact that this is a long event, and so for those who need to leave, there should also be time for you to leave, and we're happy to stay and take further questions, have a further conversation. The 3 points that I heard come out the strongest in everything that has been said today are accountability, context, and linkages. There's the need for accountability both for the government and for our collaboration between each other, but also for ourselves, that we have obligations within our communities. We have obligations, and we need to know how to hold ourselves and each other accountable for that. So accountability at all those levels. The need to look at the context, that there's not, I think, Chester, you said, there can't be a straitjacket approach to these things. We can't just have the same approach to everything. We do need to look at what's the right timing, what's the right phrasing, how do we talk about these issues? Is it a question of saying I have special rights, or is it a question of saying we're all in the same boat and we all have these rights? So the need to look at context, incredibly important when we work for our communities, with our communities, etc. The need for linkages, and that's both conceptual and also quite literally. The linkages that are conceptual have to do with this intersectionality, how all of our issues are interlinked. This is really where we ended this conversation, but also very much where we started. The conversation about sexual rights, about human rights, about reproductive rights, about women's rights, it's also that conversation about LGBTI rights, or the rights of people regardless of our sexual orientation, gender identity. So making sure that we look at this. You talked about the rights of different tribes, also the white community, and sort of the racial aspect is also incredibly important, both in Africa and elsewhere. solidarity, that's a level of conceptual linkages that's important and that we need to look at in context. But also quite literally the linkages that we have so that we can pass information back and forth, so that it's not just one-way information, but that it really goes in both directions. And that has an impact. And you've both spoken to the impact of all of this, information passing through, going through the UN and back again, and actually generating change on the ground. And I think that that's sort of the last thing that came out for me, the change that we need, or as Dorothy was saying, this is the time to act. And for that, we need resources and we need capacity. So that's sort of where I would end this, the distilling of this conversation. There's still an incredible need for resources and capacity because we have spoken a lot, and it's time to act. We do have another 10 minutes for final comments. I want to give the floor first to our guests for final comments, and then if there's anybody else who has a burning question, we can take that afterwards. But
I think for me, really, thank you for summing that up. And I think those are the key issues that we need to continuously engage with. How do we make governments accountable? How do we foster relations between ourselves as activists, as partners working on the issues, and also as our families? But I think also we also need to go beyond that and look at the wellness of individuals that are continuing to do the work that we're doing. I think it is emotionally draining for some of us, and sometimes we forget to take care of ourselves and continue to be buoyed on by the work that we do and the issues as they come out. But I think it's also important for us to sometimes take time out and really look at self-care, because these issues are really heavy. Sometimes we forget about that as activists. That's why sometimes suffer emotional breakdowns, sometimes that isolation itself sometimes plays out. You go into a space of human rights activists, but you find yourself enjoying tea on your own, and it plays on our minds, and those silent issues that continue to play out in our minds, and we don't have space where we really can talk about that and really start addressing those issues, burnout, stress, all those issues. And I think it's important that we continue to look at how we address those issues holistically.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that we're having this conversation for the reason that I trust that we transit to action from here, so that we do not meet and then talk and have it so brilliantly summarized and then leave it at that. We almost go away with a commitment to ourselves on what we are going to do to take this forward. And part of taking things forward, for me, is important to invest in young leadership. When I look behind me in Nigeria, I can count how many people are there. And I'm already seeing those who mentored me going into retirement. Myself, I don't know if I put in a long time, maybe 20 more years, maybe. But after that, someone else has to stand there. And it is not in 20 years' time that we now go and bring someone and say, oh, yeah, take Dorothy's place. It won't work. So it is now that we have to start to do those investments, both from our side at home, but also our international allies to begin to recognize, that we need to bring up young activists. So don't call Dorothy all the time to come here. Please call younger women to also come. It's true, the first time they come, you will invest more than you will gain. But over time, the gains are a lot more than if you just keep calling, me to come or Chester. So for me, that would be a very important thing to take away, so that we have a sustained activism and then engagement of people who are committed, who are passionate about the issues, not people who are doing it because they want to survive, like a salary job, and that's why we don't take time for coffee, Chester. If you go and drink coffee before you come back, UN would have signed something stupid. So don't go and drink coffee. We'll continue to work. That's what we do. 7 a.m. to 4 a.m. we are in the corridors, and that for me has really been like a special arena for capacity building. And I take very seriously how I manage my time in environments where negotiations are taking place. And some of these younger people don't know this. They want to come and see New York. So they'll do 2 hours in the UN building and do the rest 7 hours, doing shopping, Macy's and the rest, yeah? So we should have capacity building spaces for upcoming activists so that they can develop the kind of attitude that we have, which is it innate? Is it built? Yeah, I don't know, but I'm sure that we can have them if we invest in them. So now is the time to make the commitment in our various ways to make sure that happens.
I would like to end the event here with our commitment to ourselves, which I also take very seriously, and our commitment to the future, which is why we do this work. We can stick around and have more of an informal conversation for a little while, but just to make sure that we've been sitting for a while. So thank you all so much for coming. You're very welcome.